And really, over the last couple of years, you've seen market rent theory at work. Rents have gone up for a lot of landlords. And interesting enough, we've had a rate cut, and I haven't heard any landlords putting their rents down. Welcome to the Urban Property Investor. I'm your host, Sam Saggers, here to help you crack the code of real estate wealth. Today's show, code cracking stuff. We're going to dig into really the concept of cash flow. We're going to pull apart how rents actually grow. I am a big believer in studying economics to understand how rental performance works and really studying the masters behind economic theories. And today I want to go through really 8 economic principles around rents rising in Australia and really how you as a property investor can also invest in the rental marketplace and make sure you know you're going to get a real rental premium from your assets over time. So, hey, welcome back, regulars. You know the drill. Play the program in double speed. Get your life back. Of course, all the episodes are actually lessons on real estate, so feel free to dart about. But I've got fruit flies. Yes, I love apples. I'm an apple eater. Yes, I love a green apple, a red apple, a Granny Smith apple. I'm an apple whore. And because I'm an apple whore, I have apples on my table. But guess what? A fruit fly found my apple and he's invited many other fruit flies. And now I have an office of fruit flies. And really, they're tricky little buggers to eradicate. So I've got fruit fly traps now. So I am a podcaster in a fly trap, which blows my mind. But besides the flies, life is good. And today we're going to talk about really making sure we get on the end game. Now, I ran a little bus tour the other day, a little tour teaching people about real estate. And one of the chaps on the tour, actually, I helped him invest in some real estate. And it was only 3 years ago. And the real estate the gentleman bought, he paid sort of $670,000 for the real estate. And today it's certainly well above 1.1 million. So he's made a fortune when it comes to its capital growth rate. But that's not what impressed me. What impressed me was his rent went from a starting rent of around $600 a week to today, the real estate is renting for $900 a week. He is positive cash flow on the investment. And of course, that's powerful because when you're not tipping into your back pocket to control real estate, you don't stress about anything, really. You don't stress about interest rates. You don't stress about effectively, not being able to go out to dinner because you're pouring your heart and soul into real estate to prop it up to create wealth. When you're positive cash flow, life is pretty good. In fact, most positive cash flow people other than me wouldn't have a problem with fruit flies, but I am the positive cash flow fruit fly hater. But when I coach people to buy real estate, I do often talk about the rental marketplace, the dynamics around rent. And really, not a lot of people actually understand the rental dynamics and what can drive rents up in value. So today I wanted to give you that lesson. I want you to understand there is economics around it. It's not just blind luck if rents go up. And quite often property investors, when they think of property investing, they often think the same thing happens to every single person, as in there's a giant real estate market, and if the property market moves or the rental market moves, it's a bit of a universal trait that everyone kind of wins or loses. But actually, real estate is very individual. And the more economic pressure you can have on an individual piece of real estate, the better off you're going to be. Now, again, when you think about real estate is all about your end game. The fact that you're taking money, hard earned money that you could spend today on yourself, and you invest that into your future self through the idea of property investment, often means you're going to bleed cash flow to get capital growth. The best real estate is very negative of cash flow. If you think about some of the most amazing pieces of real estate in Australia today, they are millions and millions of dollars, but could never get rent to support those millions and millions of dollars. And so the yields are very, very low. So in fact, the highest growth real estate has very low returns. So when I put real estate deals together, I'm very mindful that people don't like to pull a lot of cash out of their back pocket to prop up real estate. Most people want a bit of a middle ground. They don't want nasty positive cash flow properties in weird mining towns and remote rural areas that are only positive cash flow. In other words, they have a high rent because there's never been capital growth. No, most people want capital growth, but most people also want to see their real estate go from being negative cash flow to positive cash flow over a period of time. Now, the scenario I just mentioned, the gentleman went from negative cash flow to positive cash flow effectively in 3 years. So it doesn't cost that man anything to own that real estate. And of course, if you went off his ratio of debt to rent, he's well and truly ahead. So if we're going to build a portfolio, we need to start with the end game in mind. Watch your maths. And of course, for a lot of people, the way I explain this is a lot of people want $100,000 gross passive income in retirement. Well, on $2 million worth of real estate, producing a 5% gross return, you will produce $100,000 of cash flow or rental cash flow from property. So 5% equals $100,000. But my argument has always been you've got to adjust your metrics for inflation. $100,000 in 20 years' time ain't going to be worth $100,000. So the only way to adjust for inflation is to make sure rents outpace inflation. And of course, what if instead of $100,000 passive cash flow of $2 million worth of real estate paid off, you had 10% cash flow from $2 million worth of real estate paid off? That would not be $100,000 in rent. That would in fact be $200,000 in rent. That $200,000 in rent that you would be getting down the track would well and truly compensate you for your future life. You would be able to live quite comfortably. You could drive a nice car. If you've paid off your debt on your home, you're going to have enough money to do all sorts of things. A couple of holidays a year, some nice nights out, some nice wine. You won't have to drink out of the goon bag, out of the fridge, which we know, that's not living good. You don't have to holiday at Lake Wedo. You don't have to get in a caravan and sit on the side of a lake for 60 days a year because I don't know. Maybe you like sitting on a lake for 60 days a year, but you could be doing something else. You could be going to, I don't know, Europe or something. Anyway, I've probably offended those people that love sitting near lakes. I've offended you. I know that. There are a lot of people. I have a lot of people who work with me at work. They love camping. There's campers out there. And I don't want to be accused of being a camp hater, but all I'm trying to point out is if we get the rental scenario right, you're going to do well. Now, remember, I say this a lot. There's two types of tenants: lifestyle tenants, people who are renting a better life and have money. They may even own real estate themselves. They may have multiple properties, but they don't want to live in an area which doesn't match their ambition. They want to live in an area with a beach or some beautiful coffee shops or close to work, or they want to identify differently. So they lifestyle rent. Of course, because Australia is a bit of a have and have not country these days, certainly a lot of people at the bottom of the food chain struggle to keep up with the cost of living. And because they struggle to keep up with the cost of living, they struggle with the concept that that inflation is a thing. They struggle with the ability to keep up with supply and demand of real estate, and they fall behind. And really, I refer to that end of the market as half a week away from broke. And the problem with a half a week away from being broke tenant marketplace is not the human being. It's not a personal attack on people with less or who are less fortunate. It's just a reality of it. When you don't have spare income to pay more, there's a tipping point where you simply cannot pay more. So for a landlord, there's a lot of questions to be said, because if you're designing your retirement around property, the other equation is you're designing your retirement around the people that rent in those properties. And if you're too far off the beaten track in a downtrodden neighborhood with socioeconomic issues, you're not going to get the rental growth you think you're going to get. In other words, you're going to wake up with $2 million worth of real estate paid off, where a 5% yield maybe becomes a 6% yield, but inflation's, already crushed a lot of that. So we don't want to end up in that space. We want to use actual economics to make sure that the rents we use get us to where we need to go. Now, if we go through some economic rent theories, we can have a little look into how it all works. Now, probably the most famous economic rent theory is market rent theory, and it's probably the only one anyone ever talks about. Market rent theory is pretty simple, right? It's supply versus demand. How many tenants are out there? How many properties are out there? And effectively, conversely, how does that interface? Now, market rent theory is it's an economic principle that dates back to probably the greatest economist that ever lived, Adam Smith. It's pretty normal to talk about that. If there's a glut of properties in the marketplace, there's going to be lower rents. If there's a extra supply of people but not enough properties produced, rents are going to go up. And really, over the last couple of years, you've seen market rent theory at work. Rents have gone up for a lot of landlords. And interesting enough, we've had a rate cut, and I haven't heard any landlords putting their rents down. So this is the interesting part, is quite often when there is a time of inflationary interest rates, rents will go up. The cost will be passed on to the tenant, but when rents or when inflation subsides and the cash rate floors, no landlord is putting their rents down. So it becomes this kind of really good equation for those people with real estate. But as we know, market rent theory is easy. You can see it in a couple of variables. Firstly, the price people pay for rent, but equally you can see it typically in the vacancy rate. If the vacancy rate is low, you can usually get a correlation of a number that the market has the ability to put rents up. Now, a balanced market is 3% vacancy rate. 4% would mean the tenant is very much in charge. 2% means the landlord is very much in charge. Below 2%, really the landlord has the opportunity to push rents up and pass on a market rent increase. Market rent increase. Now, again, this is really where the entire rhetoric in Australian real estate focuses. Focus on market rent theory. Property managers are trained on market rent theory. Investors are trained on market rent theory. Property experts are trained on market rent theory. Can you analyze supply and demand dynamics to work out where the rental market sits? It's effectively probably the number one equation when it comes to rents. But there are other economic theories. And so when I put together property deals for investors, I'm using not market rent theory, I'm using other economic theories around rent. Market rent theory, really, you can't control that. It's not within your control as a property investor. We can't control population growth. We can't control effectively supply levels. We can't control interest rates. We can't control social housing coming into the market. We can't control any of that. But as we know, market rent theory is just the basis of the marketplace itself, no different to the sales market. But there are other rent theories. And again, if you position what you buy around other rent theories, you're going to get a higher rate of rental growth. And when you get a higher rate of rental growth, you get to a positive cash flow point faster. The gentleman I mentioned, he's got to a positive cash flow point in 3 years. That's a very fast period of time. It's a mixture of market rent, but also other rental theories, and we'll touch on that. So the next economic theory you need to know if you're going to be a property investor is bid rent theory. And bid rent theory is the idea that commercial properties interfacing with residential properties create a high traffic area which influence the value of rental properties. In other words, when a area has both commercial and office and also residential, the supply of real estate and the functionality of commercial and office interface with the residential, and you get this ability to put rents up in those areas at a faster rate. And again, it's just economic principles that land use has to create a return. And again, like if commercial or even office or even light industrial is renting so well, then the idea is even residential often gets turned into commercial. And again, you get this kind of like supply demand dynamic around bid rent theory. Some other theories which I think are really, really important for property investors is one that I use a lot. I use this a lot to find economic growth in real estate. Problem with the real estate in Australia today is, you might be investing in a property and it could be an absolute gun area. You could be paying $800,000 for the investment. And, the rental market's $650, $700 a week. And, you're like, oh, well, I'll chuck in the difference. But it would be nice to know that the marketplace I'm buying in will get rental growth, because the maths, if you're in that situation for a long period of time, can be quite draining. Really, we want that $800,000 investment to eventually get $1,000 a week. So there is something you can study known as the tenant rent gap or rent gap theory. Now, I use rent gap theory a lot to find under-rented rental marketplaces. Now, again, if you think about how Australia works, the unwritten rule is 30% of Australia's income can go to pay for housing, either a mortgage or a rental property. Now, again, if you go to the broke end of the rental marketplace, they're paying 50% of their household income to rent, which is a lot. If you're paying 50% of your household income to be a tenant, you're getting squeezed economically. And for the landlord, it's very difficult, because if someone's paying 50% of the income in an area, usually the next person equally is going to pay 50% of their income in the same area. because generally people live in areas of social status. And that socioeconomic status just mean like people at the bottom of the food chain just don't have any spare income to pay more rent. So it's very hard to put the rent up. And then what happens is, because landlords can't put the rent up, they start to create this kind of neglection on the real estate. They don't do the repairs. They don't, they pass over problems that arise, and all of a sudden you get deteriorating real estate and effectively an inability for the landlord to fix things and do things. So 30% of income is considered the sort of milestone. However, of recent times that's lifted up. So CoreLogic has reported the average across Australia of household spending on rent is 33%. Okay, 33% is not the end of the world, because even mortgages, most mortgages are pushing 40%. So it's actually cheaper to rent than have a PPR mortgage. But what we're looking for is a decent income in a suburb, household income, and a disproportionate amount of money being paid on rent, or a proportionate, rather, is probably the correct use of English, proportionate level of money spent on rent. So what I look for is below 33%. And today I'm finding marketplaces where happily I would invest my money, happily working with investors to help them invest their money. And you're talking the household income is paying 18 to 20% of their household income in rent. So the ability to put the rent up is undisputed. Will it happen overnight? No, but could there be 3 to 4 years worth of rental increases where every year another $50, another $50, another $50, and all of a sudden you're $200 to $300 more than you were 3-4 years ago? And guess what happens? That $600 a week is now $900 a week. Can the family or income profile in the suburb afford 30% of their income on rent? Yes. All that you've done is get in basically before that marketplace has exhausted its income profile. Tenant rent gap theory. And it's a great economic principle. I've actually just been working on a deal where I've been monitoring the rent gap. We've seen rents climb by $200 in that marketplace, which is great, because then the investors are no longer burning a hole in their back pocket. It's been propped up by the tenant. Remember, there's 3 sort of ways to pay for an investment property. There's you, there's the tenant, and there's the tax man. And again, if you've got the right algorithm, the tax man and the tenant will do the lion's share of the work for you. But it will take quite often 5 years to go from negative cash flow to at least a neutral cash flow point, but only if you do what I'm saying. We've got to follow economic formulas beyond market rent theory. Those formulas include bid rent theory. They include tenant rent gap theory. They also include dwelling rent gap theory. Now, if you're sitting on a property which is effectively under rented because of the condition of the property, you're not maximizing the right amount of cash flow from the asset. And this is where a lot of people struggle with rental properties. They buy a property which 50 years old, it's asbestos exterior, the roof's, half falling down, the gutters are half falling down, and every day they simply cannot maximize the rent on the land because the dwelling is proportionately not good enough. And by renovating and spending $200,000 to get another $50 a week in rent, doesn't mathematically work. Like you are overcapitalizing your spend on your cash flow. And so dwelling rent gap is real, but equally in the established market, there are plenty of dwellings that just need a few things: a new kitchen, a new stove, a new paint job, a new rip out the carpet, put floorboards in, and all of a sudden they're maximizing their rent. The rent shoots up in value, and of course, this means the investor is again controlling their outcome. The cool thing is when you've got really good rents on your property, typically it helps your serviceability. So you can go speak to the bank one more time and do it all again. The other rent gap theory is location or land rent theory. Land rent theory is one of the oldest economic principles of real estate. You cannot get an older principle than land rent theory. All land rent theory is that you get paid higher rent the closer you are to major CBD centers. And the impact on real estate over the long term is higher rental appreciation. Again, the problem with land rent theory is if you're going to buy on the doorstep to the CBD, sometimes it's expensive. So it's just knowing when to pull the trigger on the right asset close to job centers, making sure you're buying well, and you'll get land rent theory. Now, if you're 80 kilometers from the city in a semi-rural area, your rent is going to be a lot less than if you're basically 2 kilometers downtown from CBD Sydney. Now, think about Manhattan as a marketplace. The Manhattan effect. Wall Street is in Manhattan. Manhattan is a neighborhood in New York. And the rents are mind-blowing. Like, people pay for land rent theory in New York per month like $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 in rent for a larger 3-bedroom apartment. That's incredible. And it's no different in Sydney, not to that extreme, but our mature marketplaces where there is financial districts, they can huge rents. I mean, do yourself a favor, go to the Rocks in Sydney and have a look at what people pay for rent on realestate.com for a property. You know, it's $2,000 a week for an apartment. That's $100,000 a year. Now, of course, you've got to know when to time buying the asset, but the asset becomes positive cash flow. I used to look after a friend of mine's property in Kirribilli. She paid $47,000 for it in 91. It now rents for $1,800 a week. The cash flow is like just there is no debt, and it's just all cash flow. But where can you get $1,800 a week in rent? Can you get that? In a regional area, in a small town, on the edge of the city? Can you do that? Well, of course, it will be challenging. Can you do it closer to proximity to job centers? And it doesn't have to be just the CBD. The idea of land rent theory is proximity to job centers, public transport, shopping districts, school districts, beach districts, recreational districts. All of that will affect the value of your rental return. Location. It's a overused word in this industry, but it's a real dynamic. Now, my friend on the gentleman I'm talking about who's rent from $600 to $900,000, $600 to $900 per week. The market rent theory helped, but what really accelerated that asset's performance is what is known as monopoly rent theory. Monopoly rent theory is unique real estate in highly desirable areas can achieve a premium because it's tightly held and the principle of scarcity. And really, what helped him achieve those rental returns was he bought in a stunning, award-winning, architecturally designed building in a beautiful location, and really the building itself was stunning. It was full of lots of extra benefits to the renter. And because of the monopoly-based approach of the tightly held nature of living in the complex, there's a waiting list for people to live in the complex. So those that do live in the complex have to pay more and more and more to keep other people from taking their position. And again, this is all driven around the idea of effectively monopolizing a property. And again, that can also be the conversation of economic rent theory, where again, so these are actual economists, Alfred Marshall, economic rent theory, that the idea of how land and property features intertwine actually can create capital growth, but also rental growth on real estate. And so the right uniqueness, property features, added amenity will create higher rent. And really then you've got monopoly rent theory unfolding, where because it's unique, because of economic rent theory, you can monopolize what you have because everyone wants it. And you see that in places and you see that in properties. You know, everyone wants to live in Bondi. You see the rental returns in Bondi be very, very high. Everyone wants to live in certain highly desirable buildings. You see the rents in those buildings become very, very high. Really, the other principle which is really important to rents growing is bad management impact theory. And I think a lot of people don't really understand what it takes to manage real estate. I mean, I've been a property manager. I've walked in those shoes, and I tell you, like, a lot of people are psychopaths as landlords. Like, they just are anxious, complete anxious people that can't handle the slightest bump on the journey. And it's challenging for property managers because that industry isn't really geared up for the psychological nature of what property investment actually is for a lot of people. And a lot of landlords really do misbehave. They can be very, very, erratic at times. A property is not rented in 1 week, and it's like, well, that happens. It's normal. But bad management impact theory is that a bad property manager causes challenges for the tenant, and then the tenant won't pay more rent. And bad management impact theory is not only the property manager, it is the landlord. Now, if the landlord won't fix a problem, why would the tenant pay more rent? That's kind of the theory here. And so what you end up getting is what landlords can become what are known as slumlords. They don't fix anything. Because they don't fix anything, the tenants won't pay more in rent. And even if the tenants leave, the property managers are reluctant to push the rental envelope on the property because they know the behavior of the landlord is going to be quite often compromised or compromise their position. So property management, if you've got the right property manager, and I take an interest in property management, I've got an absolute interest in it, that I think property management into the future is going to be very different to what it was. I think property managers are becoming more and more, it's becoming more of a high-tech field. It's all about efficiencies. It's all about investment. Holding real estate is hard. Buying real estate is easy. And I've seen a lot of business models come and go that are bad management impact theories. You think about like purple bricks, like came in and everyone could get cheap property management, or you've had all sorts of stuff where literally it's a race to the bottom. And the only thing I've seen work is property managers that push rents and understand investments. And again, landlords also need to understand investments and understand how rents move. Now, again, like if you think about economic rent theory, the idea that a property is unique, if you think about monopoly rent theory, how you can control or monopolize a marketplace, having the right real estate, that if you've got the right real estate using land rent theory, close to epicenters, close to job centers, public transport, if you think about rent gap theory, just upgrading your properties and making sure you're on top of basically the dwelling rent gap, like the condition of the dwelling. Then you've got the tenant rent gap and bid rent theory. All of that sits under market rent theory. And again, if you can put them all together, you just get this higher rate of rental performance. Now, again, you could argue that even the property I'm talking about, which went from $600 a week to $900 a week in 3 years, it got an influence from market rent theory. It got an influence from bid rent theory because where it was it's also pressured by the use of commercial properties. It didn't necessarily get tenant rent gap theory. It didn't get dwelling rent gap theory, but it got land rent theory. It was close to epicenters of jobs. It was close to good schools. It was close to CBDs. And then it got monopoly rent theory from economic rent theory. So economic rent theory is a nice building. It's a nice property. There were not that many nice properties where it is. And so it went up in value. But it also got good management impact theory. The manager looks after the property so well that tenants love staying there and will pay higher rents. Wow. Put it all together, folks, and you end up in a place where you go from negative cash flow to positive cash flow, and that's the game of controlling and holding real estate. All right. Well, I'm not sure if a few fruit flies came on screen. I hope not. I'm going to go and see how I can eradicate it. I was just Googling. Maybe I need some vinegar and some plastic and try and get them into a little cup. And yeah, it's got a big job ahead of me. Yeah, could take weeks to kill fruit flies. They're tough little buggers. They know how to survive. Or maybe I should give up apples. I don't know. All right. On that note, on giving up apples, that's the end of the show. Take care. Talk soon. Thanks for tuning in to the Urban Property Investor. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube so you never miss an episode. I'd love for you to rate the show and share it with your family and friends. Let's spread the word about property investing. Stay connected between episodes on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And check out the rest of our podcast network at positivementor.com.au. And if you're serious about growing your property portfolio, don't miss our complimentary Property Investor Nights. Register now via the link in the show notes. See you next time.